You're listening to a social justice podcast, an exploration of our world's social issues, hosted by Nicola Spurling on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwikwetlem, Katzie, and Qayqayt peoples. Hello, this is a social justice podcast. I'm your host, Nicola Spurling, and today I'm joined by Taz and Nina from Pivot Legal Society. Taz, can you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Taz Khandwani. I am the Communications and Digital Engagement Manager at Pivot Legal Society. Born in Pakistan, moved here when I was almost 13. Yeah, that immigrant sort of experience is ingrained in my brain now, and I can't get away from it. And a lot of those experiences as a kid sort of led me to where I am now, and getting a better understanding of the ways in which a state enforces its laws on people and polices our daily lives. And obviously the work that we do and the communities that we work alongside, their experiences are much worse than what I had to go through and continue to, I suppose. But it gave me a window into what people might be going through. And I think it's maybe a blessing in disguise.
And Nina.
Hi, my name is Nina Taghaddosi. My English name is Nina. I'm the Anti-Stigma Campaigner at Pivot Legal Society. I ended up at Pivot because of, similar to Taz, the experiences I had growing up led me to working in the social justice field. I'm a registered social worker, and whenever I say that, I have to preface it by saying that I actively try to work against social work and dismantle the harm that social work has done in Canada, especially towards Indigenous people and people of color. And I grew up with a family that came here as refugees from Iran in the 80s, and I grew up hearing stories around the dinner table of my mom being in protests and demonstrations in Iran when she was a teenager. She ended up being shot in the leg by the police, and she wore the bullet fragment around her neck when I was a child. So that's a memory that I grew up with, and it's been ingrained in me how violent the police are. And so when I started hearing about Pivot Legal Society, I knew that I wanted to work here.
And thank you both for joining. I'm really excited for this conversation and interested to see what you have to say. So to start off with, can you explain what Pivot Legal Society is and how the organization came to exist?
Yeah, we are a legal advocacy organization. We're not a legal clinic, so we don't have lawyers who provide advice or representation to people for the most part. There are a few cases we've taken on for clients in the past, including helping clients with police complaints when there were a rash of really violent police interactions in the downtown east side many years ago. But generally, we are more of an advocacy and campaign-focused organization, and we work directly alongside communities that are impacted by social exclusion, marginalization, oppression, and they're all linked to poverty in some way and stigma. Those really are the core of the issues that folks are experiencing in the work that we do. And we work on a few different campaign areas. So we have our campaign to address sex workers' rights, and we'll get into that a little bit more later on when we talk about our campaigns in more depth.
We've had some conversations about sex work on this podcast as well, so that'll be interesting.
Yeah, we saw those. And we want to end police violence, eventually dismantle the policing system and all carceral systems. We work against stigma and discrimination and the legalization of drugs, the decriminalization of the use of drugs, and housing for all. So Pivot started in 2001 when a lawyer and a community activist got together because they noticed that there was an increase in people getting transmitted HIV and AIDS because there wasn't anywhere for people to use drugs safely. There were no overdose prevention sites. There were no safe consumption sites in Vancouver. So things were being transmitted through sharing needles. And at the same time, the police were increasing their crackdown on people who were in public space. So these two issues were happening at the same time. And that's when the lawyer and community activists got together and decided to start Pivot Legal Society.
Wow. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Taz?
We've come a long way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've come a long way. There was at one point where Pivot had a legal clinic. It lasted about 4 years or so.
Yes.
Yeah, funding is really hard in this sort of area, right? And in our current iteration, we've gotten to a point where we become way more principled about where we receive funding from, and so that narrows down where we do get our funds from. Yeah, and that also prevents us to be able to like do some of those things that are, I think, necessary in the community. And so we do our best to provide referrals when somebody does come to us, though we are very clear, like Nina mentioned, that we're not a legal aid or a legal clinic. It's tough sometimes turning people away, but
Yeah, it seems like there's also the aspect of trying to find people that are able to work those clinics if they do exist. I mean, Community recently received quite a lot of money from the government and a few other sources to start a pro bono legal clinic. And now the challenge is finding a legal director for that clinic.
Yeah.
Have you noticed that as well, that finding people that are willing to do the work that you're trying to do? And obviously you're not a legal clinic, but the roles within your organization, are they challenging to fill?
I can speak to my own experience. I mean, as a registered social worker, this isn't necessarily the type of work you would expect us to end up in. Normally, social workers are working within the confines of the colonial system that's been established in Canada. So they're working in hospitals and prisons, health clinics. They work in Ministry of Children and Family Development. So ending up in an advocacy, policy advocacy, campaigning, research organization is unusual. And we do have a few lawyers working with us, but a lot of the people working with us don't necessarily have an education or training in this. It's lived experience and experience with organizing and activism that makes people really valuable.
And can you talk about some of the other organizations that you work with? You mentioned that there are a variety of advocacy organizations locally that you do work with. What are some of those?
We work with the Vancouver area network of drug users really closely. So within each of our campaign areas, we are closely allied with organizations that directly serve the people who are impacted. So on the drug policy campaign, our staff lawyer and drug policy campaigner has lots of relationships with lots of different drug user-led organizations and people advocating for decriminalization of drugs. So I could name them all if you want me to. I could name a few.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we need to go through the full list. I just know that in my work with both Vancouver Pride and Community, Pivot Legal comes up quite often in our conversations. So it seems like you do a lot of work that either is with those organizations or surrounds issues that those organizations work with. I know we've had, you've talked about AIDS or HIV as well. We've had AIDS Vancouver and Health Initiative for Men on the podcast as well, and I know that they do a lot of work around that field. So I'm just kind of curious to know what sort of overlap exists, and it sounds like there's quite a lot of that. So
yeah, I think one of the things I'm really proud of Pivot staff for is building those relationships out. And we do our best to like do that in a very respectful and honest and genuine way. Like, of course, Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users is like one of the other groups that we have worked very closely with. But then there are groups like BC Poverty Reduction Coalition that we are a part of. BCCLA we have a really good relationship with and really respect the work that they do. There's various organizations on the ground that are, not incorporated as nonprofits and whatnot, and a lot of autonomous actions that take place and individuals that show up. And it's funny you said how do you get people to like work in these sort of areas, and often what you find is the same people showing up in different places, right? It's the same like movement lawyers, it's the same organizers, it's the same people that are really building that base out and providing that mentorship to folks coming after them or along with them. And yeah, as Nina mentioned, that a lot of these groups are working directly with folks, and so it's not something that we like to do, like taking credit for things. So often we can be found behind the scenes, providing legal supports when necessary, doing the public education workshops and panels, interviews like this. Definitely help get the word out about our work. And I think like you mentioned, Pivot's name comes up, and that's largely because of the way that we engage with the community. right? So.
Yeah, and where does your passion to address poverty and social exclusion come from?
Lived experience.
Yeah.
Grew up in poverty with my mom, who came here as a refugee, living with physical disabilities and mental illness, and raising 2 kids on her own, and not speaking English very well, and trying to navigate a racist, violent system that we ended up immigrating into. And eventually, the Ministry of Children and Family Development was called on my family when I was 8 years old, and they forced themselves onto my family, removed us from our mother's care and placed us with our dad. And just living through the violence of the family policing system, in poverty, not getting help to be lifted out of poverty. My mother didn't receive the supports she needed to be a parent who was well-resourced. Us kids didn't receive the resources we need to have enough food to eat at school. And so that's where my passion comes from, and also from the activism that my mom was engaged in when she was a younger person in Iran. And I also have an auntie on my dad's side who was a political activist and ended up being a political prisoner in Iran. And so it's in the family.
Wow. And I mean, that sounds like a very similar story to what Indigenous people in Canada have had to go through as well, in terms of being stripped away from their parents and being raised in environments that are not necessarily conducive to their well-being. Mm-hmm. Are you seeing that there's a lot of that overlap between the experience of Indigenous people and the experience of immigrants?
I would say that because we live in a racist colonial system, we're all subjected to the same types of harm and violence. I would hesitate to compare the experiences of Indigenous people to immigrants, because my family was forced into the diaspora, but Indigenous people are on their lands, and they are continuously fighting to protect their lands, protect their children, their ways of being, their languages, and immigrants have been removed from that. So there's no comparison, but what I will say is that Indigenous people in Canada are extremely, what's the word?
Not resilient. Inspiring, yeah.
Inspiring.
Resilience seems like an odd way to say resistance.
Definitely not a choice in that regard.
Yeah.
And Taz, where does your inspiration come from?
Late in life. As mentioned, so I moved here as a kid, the youngest of 3. At the age that I moved here, obviously I had an easier time integrating into society here, whereas my brother and sister struggled a bit more. Of course, my parents struggled. But we came from privilege. And so it was a shock moving to Canada, because then we had to start from scratch almost. We were lucky. We had support systems here. My mom was able to get into her line of work. My dad struggled, but he was able to, through the diaspora, find work, and we were able to settle. And when we moved first, we had a place to be. And so the precarity wasn't felt right away. It was only after a few years where we started to feel the crunch of being new in a place where you're trying to adjust. For myself, I brushed off a lot of incidents that I could not look past now. But when I was in high school, a lot of things happened that I just figured that this is just part of life. I guess some of the early experiences that radicalized me, I was being detained in the principal's office in grade 10 for something that I hadn't done, wasn't going to do. But somebody had overheard a conversation and told the principal that, these kids are going to call a bomb threat. And that is a scary situation to be in as, in a grade 10. I don't even know how old I was at that time. And being detained in the principal's office, and then having my dad there. And that was the first time I saw him cry. And, those were some of the early experiences that kind of opened up my eyes to the ways in which it's easier for people in my position, racialized communities, young people, people who are new to this place, to be abused without, being aware of their rights. Later on in life, I was lucky enough to have mentors around me who, like my grandma, who convinced me that I should go back to school. And so I did, and I went back to school to study criminology, and this is like early days where I thought, oh yeah, this is how, I make a difference, understand the law, go work for the Crown, and then I have all this like discretion, and then I just won't pursue charges. It wasn't long before I left, didn't finish. But what I did realize was, through being exposed to education, my own position on these lands. And then that forced me to also take a stock of where I came from and what that place represents. Pakistan is this so-called post-colonial state. Although it carries with it the colonial legacy and the systems that were left behind. A place where, we grew up around a lot of conservatism, and that just became an everyday part of life. But being exposed to, as I mentioned, some of the education in school allowed me to also understand the ways in which my own family members, like my mom, my sister, my grandma, mostly the women in my life, and how they were subjugated. And that sort of like allowed me to extend that understanding and empathy, I suppose, and opened up my eyes to a whole lot more. And then engaging in conversations with people, trying to find community to belong in, a lot of introspection and a lot of soul searching, I suppose, led me to a place where I then surrounded myself with people that were engaged in social justice. As you might remember, I wasted a lot of my years with the NDP, but the one thing that did teach me was the power of organizing.
That's definitely one thing that party's really good at, right?
Yeah, especially in BC. But that experience, I can't discount it. I think it did allow me to do political education for myself, to engage in community in a good way, and in a way that I was able to critique that party from inside, and then coming to the resolution that like it's a waste of time. We are burning ourselves out, trying to change these systems from within, and reform only makes that system stronger. And why would I want to make a system strong that is actively engaged in subjugation of various people, communities, and more importantly, the rightful stewards of these lands? Yeah, I think a long-winded way of saying I saw the light shining on settler colonialism as this, driving force of oppression on these lands. And then, of course, I am an anti-capitalist, and that was no easy journey either, right? As immigrant families, as immigrant kids, as immigrants, we were told that keep your head down, work hard, you will get ahead in life. It's hard to keep your head down when your friends, family members are struggling, and when that hits your doorsteps, it's time to take stock of things and figure out where to go next. And again, like I said, I was lucky enough to have mentors around me, people that allowed me to read, understand things, expose me to ideas that I wouldn't have searched on my own, ultimately leading to the understanding that this system that we are living in, not just here but across the world now, is dedicated to maximizing profits over people. And I am people.
Yep.
Yeah, I matter, right?
Absolutely.
I think we all do.
And now that we have a sense of sort of what Pivot Legal Society is, how you both became involved and why you're passionate about the work that you're doing, can you talk about the services that Pivot offers to the public?
Yeah, we do strategic litigation as one of our strategies. So we will, working alongside the communities that are directly impacted by the social issues, they will let us know what laws are harming them, what practices and policies are harming them, and we take our lead from those communities. And so we will decide based on their input which legal challenges we need to make. So a few recent examples are in the drug policy campaign. And Taz, you're going to have to help me out here because there's a lot of back and forth these days with decriminalization and recriminalization in BC.
Pivot Legal Society, as part of a coalition, of various groups had pushed the provincial government in BC to apply for the decrim pilot. We got that for about a year or so. Of course, there was a lot of backlash because public use became more apparent. And so that meant that the government had a few choices, I suppose, and what they chose was to give in to the reaction. It was challenged. Bill 34 was challenged, which would have restricted public use under the guise of protecting children and public spaces like parks and whatnot. Except in the original decrim pilot, those were already spaces that were exempt. So people couldn't use there anyways. But it was presented in the media and in their press releases as if that's the problem. So it was challenged by the Harm Reduction Nurses Association, and Caitlin Shane from Pivot Legal Society represented them. Before a decision could be made, the province went around the whole case and straight to the feds and asked them to increase discretion for police to move people along, provide them with services and quote-unquote services, if you're listening online, not watching, and confiscate the drugs. So public space became, again, a hotbed of police violence. The obvious issue there is that people have nowhere to be. And so they're using where they are. And where they are is around their friends, their community. And because municipalities, cities and towns and villages, are not following through with the health order that was passed down by the province to open up consumption sites, safe consumption sites, and enable more drug testing, leaves people to use in public space. If they have nowhere to be, the municipalities and the province aren't doing what they want to do, then people will use where they are. So it's really just scapegoating drug users. And just to make a point as well that the 2.5 grams was well below what was being asked of the province by drug user groups and drug users themselves, especially in rural areas where you have to go far away to pick up whatever you need and you come back. And so to go and pick up only 2.5 grams makes no sense, especially if you are a person who doesn't have a fixed address, you're poor and you can't afford to travel, and so you pick up the amount that you do. But of course, first we got a half-assed measure presented as this like fix all for everything, when in reality it was meant to decriminalize use and users, right? And then when it didn't work like they wanted it to, right? Oh, it should have solved everything. There should be no overdoses now. We made it legal to possess 2.5 grams in certain places. Mm-hmm. When it didn't work, when the supply became even more toxic, they gave in to the reaction from the right because they started seeing the writing on the wall.
This reaction being, it's a failed experiment, basically.
It's a failed experiment. We're just enabling people and every kind of stigmatizing term that you can throw under the sun. And often the solutions being suggested by the general public is to just sweep the problem away, hide it. They don't want to see it. And of course, we know what happens when people are using out of sight, out of mind. They die.
That's why we have an opioid epidemic, or part of the reason.
Well, yeah, and it's really a toxic supply crisis. We've seen historically what prohibition does to the substances that are being prohibited. There were many years of alcohol prohibition that showed us what happens. And so this war on drugs has been going on for quite some time. And in that period, we've tried the solutions that are now being suggested as the new solutions to restrict drug use and to prohibit it. And this is like, war on drugs, 2.0, 4.0, who knows at what point we were at. But instead of addressing the actual core issue of the supply being toxic, the substances being toxic, the users, for various reasons, who use for various reasons, are being scapegoated. And as Garth Mullen had put it, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. The BC NDP seems to be reaching, to the top of the polls by stepping on dead bodies of users, and they seem to be okay with it.
And you've talked about the BC NDP, you've talked about pushing for these changes provincially. Is that sort of the scope of the organization? The demographic, the region that you're focusing on and serving is British Columbia generally?
I think our work is largely focused in the downtown east side, but by nature of what we're working on, it impacts the province, but not just the province. It has an impact on the whole country.
This is like setting legal precedent for Canadians as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, Pivot's work around sex work had a massive impact on sex work laws, right? Like the Bedford case, however long ago that was. I'm sorry, I can't remember the year now. So the way that our work conducts itself, it's of course focused primarily in the downtown east side, but the impacts of that work are felt province-wide and Canada-wide. Our challenges to sex work laws, had a massive impact across Canada. We're still fighting to repeal some of the more draconian policies that were brought in by the Harper government, I believe. PSEPA, protection of communities, and something or other, right?
And Persons Act.
Yeah,
I can get into the sex work stuff for sure.
Yeah.
We're going to go through sort of step by step the different services that Pivot offers, so we'll have a chance to go through that.
We're still in strategic litigation.
Yeah.
The original question.
So coming back to strategic litigation, I think there is a misconception out there that like Pivot just takes on whatever case. People contact us all the time, and we have to unfortunately turn them down. Our litigation comes out of our campaign work. And our campaign work is informed by the groups, the communities, the individuals that we work alongside. And they're the ones that are informing and providing the wisdom that allows us to take something to court. Charter challenges come about as a way to address, a specific thing that has happened, right? And that's the case across the board for any charter challenge, really. In our line of work, when things come up, we really do our best to engage with the folks that are impacted. We try to understand the situation and then decide, does it make sense for this to go to court? Because sometimes you take something to court, you lose, that can set a precedence as well, right? So you have to be really careful.
You have to make sure that you're in a position where you have a very good chance of setting the precedent you want to set, I guess.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the other thing, right? Like we recognize that we are we're hoping to work against the colonial default, but we're using the colonial tools, right? And we have lawyers that work within the colonial system. So, there's that line that we're sort of treading and like realizing like the position that we occupy. And so it makes it tough. And it's often hard decision to decide if something's going to go forward or not. Because the impacts of that can be devastating on communities, right?
And getting into those 5 areas of policy that Pivot focuses on, the 5 areas, just for the audience, are criminalization and policing, drug policy, homelessness, anti-stigma and poverty, and sex workers' rights. So we're going to go through these step by step and talk a little bit about each one. When it comes to criminalization and policing, is police misconduct something that you encounter quite often? Is it relatively rare? How prevalent of an issue, I suppose, is this?
Police misconduct, in my mind, is a misnomer because the police are conducting themselves exactly the way that they were trained to, which is with brutal, deadly, violent force. And they've proven over and over again that they are willing to kill people for minor infractions. Sometimes people aren't doing anything illegal at all, and the police will kill them. So it's very common, police misconduct. It's very widespread, and we see it a lot in the communities that we work with. People who use drugs are highly criminalized. People who do sex work are highly criminalized, because even though selling sex is not illegal in Canada, buying sex is illegal in Canada. Being a third party to sex work is illegal in Canada. So a sex worker can't hire an accountant, open up a bank account, have a security guard, work with a manager.
Have family living in the same place where you might want to work.
Yeah.
Like they could be charged with the proceeds of crime.
Yeah, exactly. And people who rely on public space are highly criminalized. So the people we work with are coming into contact with the police daily and experiencing not only like physical violence, but also being forced into the carceral system, being forced into prisons. And prison is not a solution to poverty or mental illness or addiction. So the cycle repeats itself. Once people get out of prison, they're not any better off. They're worse off because now they have a criminal record and they can't find a job, and they're leaving with nothing. Sometimes they're leaving with no shoes.
And it seems like, just from watching videos about how police interact with the public in the downtown east side specifically, that there are a lot of violations of people's rights that are just incredibly blatant, right? Just coming over, detaining someone without any reason, searching them. And there are, generally speaking, requirements for participating in that sort of behavior. There's supposed to be requirements. Is the idea just, well, these people are poor, so they're never going to sue us for this, and we can just get away with whatever it is we want to get away with?
I mean, you can go through the complaint process. It doesn't really work. Especially in like Vancouver, I would say. Right now, you have a very, no, I shouldn't say police friendly. You have the police's preferred party in power. They campaign for them to the point where, earlier.
We're talking about the city of Vancouver, right?
Yeah.
Ken Sim and his party.
Yeah, ABC. Earlier this year, police board's budget. So this is the independent oversight body. That's what it's supposed to be, unelected, whatever. Decided to slash the police board budget by 66%. And then, 4 months later or whatever, when the news came out and there was a bit of public outcry, they reversed that, not to the amount that was being asked, while at the same time like giving the police like tens of millions of dollars more. So Vancouver Police Department's budget is coming pretty close to $500 million, and at the same time the city is trying to slash the oversight body's funding. And I think beyond just that, like just back to the question that you asked, like how do they get away with it? Well, exactly for that reason. They know that a person who doesn't have a fixed address, doesn't have stable income or a status that allows them to be able to stand firm, means that they're not going to be able to pursue any accountability from the police. And even if they do, what does that accountability look like? Various police officers killed Miles Gray, and now one of them is working in a high school in Vancouver as a school liaison officer. We all saw footage of the VPD running over somebody in the downtown east side on a street that is supposed to be 30 kilometers an hour. And it happened again. And this time there isn't a camera around. So, public has to do their own investigation. And then zooming out, looking at the RCMP, and, everybody's been hearing about SERG or whatever they're called now. It becomes very clear the purpose of the police. It becomes very clear in the way that they handle mental health, so-called wellness checks. It becomes very clear with their interactions with black folks.
And this is the same department that claims that they have no internalized racism, right? Didn't
No, not
Chief
at all.
Palmer come out with a statement saying that?
Yeah. There is no racism because they hired people that look like us, New bosses, same as the old bosses. I come from a place where the policing system was literally installed by the colonial powers, and they just carried that through, right? And we know the history from there. I hope Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshi people listening to this will remember that there were a lot of people before the partition happened that joined the colonial police force because that was the only way to move forward or move up. I'm not trying to humanize these cops by saying, they're just trying to survive. I think police in Canada have flown under the radar for a long time. There hasn't been a good process for accountability. For a very long time, we had no idea what the budget for the policing was on a national level. For a very long time, and to this day, we know the disproportionate impacts of policing on Indigenous people and Black communities. We know that regardless of the race, gender, sexual orientation of the cop, they're enforcing the same system that values private property over people. And we know that when faced with police violence, you don't have good outcomes.
Well, and just from my own personal experience of trying to hold police accountable, it's sort of this dead-end path where I've been threatened to be trespassed from my police detachment in Kwikwetlem for trying to hold the police accountable for going in there and recording my conversations with them. I've had them lie about me in the media, claiming that I was sharing someone's personal information. And I've gone through all of the channels that they tell you you're supposed to go through. I've filed FOI requests, or ATIP requests. I've gone to the police station to ask them about filing complaints against officers, and none of it's ever accomplished anything. If they don't respond to an ATIP request in full, you can put in a complaint. It's probably not going to go anywhere. If they threaten to trespass you, you put in a complaint. Probably not going to go anywhere. I've emailed all of Kwikwetlem City Council about this, saying this is wrong, this shouldn't have happened. I get completely ignored. There's not an appetite from anyone to address police misconduct or whether you want to call it misconduct or not, given that the
police
system
conduct.
Police conduct, that shouldn't occur.
Yeah, we let the police get away with everything that they do. As civilians, it's our responsibility to organize, get together, and shut them down. There are a lot of people in Canada, United States doing this work, so I want to shout out a bunch of great organizations. There are groups in the US like the Upend Movement, Critical Resistance, Interrupting Criminalization Project. There are Black scholars and academics like Mariam Kaba. And in Canada, we have the Collective of Child Welfare Survivors, the Walls Down Collective. We have Robin Maynard, Abolitionist Care and Belonging, Care Not Cops. Like, we are organizing, we're getting together. We know that this system is harming us. It's not protecting us. It's protecting the wealthy elite. They've proven that time and time again when they organize the CIRG to shut down Indigenous land defenders who are still going through their court process and continue to experience colonial harm and violence. And so, yeah, we cannot expect the police to defund themselves or hold themselves accountable. It's up to us.
Yeah, and when I hear about people who are of the opinion that the police should be abolished, they're often also the same people who believe in human rights. So in concept, I suppose, or what a politician at a federal level might argue, is that the reason the police exist is to uphold our rights, right? That is what someone who is a supporter of the police might believe. So if we're talking about changing this system entirely and creating a system where there are no police, or the police have very limited roles, like researching murders or something along those lines, very serious crimes, what does that system look like in the sense that we still have freedoms to live our lives as we want to?
I'm so excited by this question. I love imagining a police-free future with my comrades. A police-free future, abolition would be very different, because it would mean that our values as a society would change. We wouldn't see illegal acts the same way that we do. We wouldn't see stealing food because you're poor and hungry as a criminal act. And people would have enough food to eat. We would have systems in place that ensure, and I'm sure the state would be involved in this in some way or another, whether you're an anti-capitalist or whatever ideology you adhere to. We would have programs that make sure that kids are fed in school. that their parents are well supported if they're refugees or have disabilities, whatever marginalized identities they belong to. Education, tuition would be free, and we just wouldn't value capital the same way, because when the police are protecting capital and we get rid of capital, there's nothing for them to protect.
So the idea would be, if you have social systems in place that ensure everyone's needs are being met, then crime just doesn't really exist at that point.
Yeah.
Well, as I was just looking up and just making sure that I quote Ruth Wilson Gilmore in a correct way. Abolition is not primarily a matter of what to get rid of, but what to build and to orient around. It's not just like a matter of like dismantling something, right? It's actually a matter of creating something instead. We have disability activists reminding us constantly that involuntary treatment does not work. But what does work is community connection. Folks that have to deal with wellness checks or have had to deal with wellness checks continually remind us that community connections can prevent a whole lot of the harms that they're experiencing. We know that harm reduction is also one of those things that is a presence of something rather than an absence of something. Presence of harm reduction means and requires necessarily a community connection, right? It comes from sex workers. It comes from queer folks who had to come together and provide safety for each other because the state wasn't going to do that for themselves, right? I think often we listen to, videos, audio, something on social media, and we see the clips, the sound bites, and of course we rely on media that focuses on sensationalized pieces of information. What we don't get to are the deep, nuanced conversations around this kind of stuff, right? Where people are genuinely gathering, getting to know each other's neighbors, creating meal trains, creating phone trees, where if something was to happen to someone, they know who to contact because they've been in conversations with each other. I don't know if anybody here has been in a fight. When you get into a fight and your friends are there, they stand up with you. But if you don't have friends, who's there? Sorry for that fight reference. It was the first thing that popped in my head.
Lived experience, baby.
Lived experience,
I've been
I suppose,
there
yeah. Right. And so I think like abolition has entered the consciousness in recent times again because of the murder of George Floyd, but it's not this isolated incident, right? We see it here, we see it out east, we see it all over the world. Policing as a system imported around the world is aimed at control of people and their behaviors. If we believe that the human spirit is capable of change, is capable of being rehabilitated, quote unquote, then we must necessarily also believe that human spirit is then capable of that change before rehabilitation is even necessary, right? If you do that through force, that may or may not work. Recidivism rates show us that it doesn't.
Yeah.
It's hard for people to deal with that because we have abdicated our responsibilities to each other and to our communities to the state. And so when things go wrong, who do you call, right? Because if you call Ghostbusters. Yeah, and if you have people that are worried about you, and if they call 911 because you're in a moment of crisis, like Ijaz Chowdhury's family did, and then watch them climb through their window and then kill your elderly brother, right? It's a messed up system, sure. But like you said, Nina, I think there are so many people, communities, and this is not new, right? Black scholars have been showing this to us for a very long time. Indigenous communities, through their medicine, have been showing this to us for a very long time. As settlers on these lands I think we're finally starting to get it. Maybe not in the numbers we need, but the next generation, through their spirit of activism, are, I think, showing that they get it. So yeah, I choose to believe there's a better world possible.
Yeah, I hope so. And moving on to one of the other policy focuses of Pivot, drug policy. How do drug policies impact the people that you're serving? And when we're talking about the people, are we talking dealers, users, or are we talking everyone?
So we got some notes from our colleague, Caitlin Shane, on this. So I'm going to read those to you. Caitlin wanted us to note that no person should be arrested for possessing drugs for their own use. The impacts of criminalization are too dangerous, particularly for poor and Black, Indigenous, and people of color who use drugs. These communities are vastly overrepresented in statistics of overdose, police profiling, and incarceration for drug-related offenses. And we do also advocate for decriminalizing necessity trafficking. And Caitlin was involved in a case called R versus Ellis that was in 2022, where they went to the BC Court of Appeal for their client Ellis, who is a mother who was necessity trafficking because she lives in poverty and has an addiction, and shouldn't be criminally charged for that. So we do believe in necessity trafficking, and that involves splitting or sharing or selling your drugs for safe supply or necessity purposes.
So we're talking specifically about drugs that are not contaminated.
Exactly, yeah. And yeah, the important point about that is that the government refuses to regulate toxic drugs, and this is unlike its response to any other substance, which it actively regulates for the purposes of ensuring quality and access. So examples are alcohol, marijuana, vape juice now, even your prescription medications, cigarettes. And so it's just a matter of time before we start regulating, producing a safe supply of opiates, whatever people need, whatever is their medicine. So because the government won't regulate the toxic drugs, people are relying on their dealers to ensure the quality of the supply as best as they can, because dealers are often the key users of drug testing technology, and often they are a trusted source for people, especially when there's a volatile and unpredictable drug supply in BC and across Canada. We're losing 7 lives a day in BC. Every year the number goes up.
It's at 8 now.
Yeah, there you go.
That's a ridiculous number.
Yeah. It's and the deaths of poor people who use drugs are not even reported anymore. The only reports of deaths of people who use drugs are wealthy people, because we don't expect wealthy people to use drugs and overdose on drugs.
So this is 8 wealthy people a day that are dying, and then just completely unreported?
No, it's a mix. So just on average, 8 people a day in BC are dying from the toxic drug supply. Yeah. When I say reporting, I mean every single time a person in BC dies of a toxic drug overdose, it's not reported except when it's someone wealthy or someone's like a student, a young person. We're like, oh, we don't expect them to use drugs.
Housed people, largely, like if you're housed, maybe middle class, whatever that means, or wealthy, it's like a big story. Like, oh no, this person died from drug use.
Oh, so we're talking like reported in the media,
Yes.
not reported in statistics.
Yes.
Okay.
Point of clarification.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, I think the crux of that is that there are dealers that people trust, because there's the same person people go back to again and again, right? And depending on like your context, you might have developed a relationship with this person, relationship based in trust. And if that person is now gone, let's say, arrested, confiscated, whatever, then you don't have that supply anymore, and then you have to go to a different supply potentially, and you don't know this supply, right? It's not tested, and you often don't have like readily available places to go test your drugs. You don't have safe consumption sites you can access. When safe supply has been rolled out, like 5% or less of users actually can access safe supply. So that's also like not that big a thing right now, even though like it's being presented in the media and by government and opposition that like safe supply is everywhere. It's so much prevalent that it's actually like being redirected all the time. Like, kids are getting their hands on safe supply. And I don't know about you guys, but I used drugs when I was in school and after. Never got it tested.
Yeah.
But God forbid, right now, like, a lot of these young people don't have trusted drug dealers, right? Like, they don't have people that they can go and buy from all the time. They're trying it sometimes here and there at parties. They don't know what they're going to be consuming.
And they're probably hiding it so they don't have someone with naloxone with them either.
No.
Right?
And then, people don't also know their rights, that, like, if somebody around you is overdosing, that you can indeed call the police or, like, emergency services to come help, and you won't be impacted if you have any substances on you. Though there is a case out, I forget exactly where, that is challenging the Good Samaritan drug laws right now, and so that could change the landscape. But in the meantime, people, again, don't have their drugs tested, can't really trust the supply, and then there's all this, like, right-wing sort of reaction around safe supply that is spreading disinformation, people pretending to be investigative journalists, talking to one person and presenting that as, like, the story across the board for everyone.
Or going into a shelter and claiming it's a safe supply site.
Yeah, it's a really weird, like, wild west right now. I feel like some government was, like, on about a different party, like, not that long ago, about creating a wild west situation in this province,
Yeah. And one of the other aspects of policy that you focus on is anti-stigma and poverty. So how is Pivot working to address stigma and poverty, and with regard to sort of what exactly?
So a few years ago, Pivot released a report called Project Inclusion. It was a research report where folks from Pivot and folks from allied drug user organizations went across BC and visited different cities and towns, different municipalities in BC, to gather information about people's access to health services, overdose prevention sites, safe consumption sites, and they found that stigma was a major reason that people couldn't get the help that they needed, and also that these communities were being highly criminalized. If you're poor and you rely on public space, you're more likely to be forced into police interactions, and more likely to be arrested and detained and imprisoned. So the Anti-Stigma Campaign started 2 years ago in 2022, and one of my major focuses is to expose stigma in bylaws, and even in just policies that impact people who experience stigma. Provincial legislation could even apply here. I'll get into the BC Human Rights Code and explain a little bit about that. But the main purpose of exposing the stigma in the creation and enforcement of bylaws is because we want to gather this data and bring it to the Attorney General, because currently the BC Human Rights Code doesn't protect a person's social condition, and a person's social condition is their socioeconomic status. So stigma and poverty are really closely linked. So a person's social condition, we're talking about when somebody has a poor social condition. So they're not doing well socially or financially. And that affects all kinds of people. Other provinces and territories in Canada protect a person's social condition. They sometimes have different wording for it, but it's basically the same idea. And there have been cases out of Quebec where students used the social condition argument to say that they were being discriminated against because they were being paid less than the employees who weren't students. And they won that case. There was another case in the Northwest Territories, which also protects social condition, where people who were receiving a form of income assistance weren't being paid in cash or by check. They were being given food stamps. And so they argued that that was discrimination because they're not trusted to make their own decisions about how to spend their money, and that's because of stigma. Stigma makes you question a person's morals and their values. And so we're currently trying to gather data to present to the Attorney General to amend the BC Human Rights Code to include the protection of a person's social condition.
Fantastic. Did you have anything to add to that, Taz?
I think the only thing I would add is that stigma can actually be very, very deadly. Mm-hmm. We have had incidences in this province and in other provinces around Canada where people have been harmed, gravely harmed, because of their social condition. Because they're poor, they're homeless. There was a case, I think last year, earlier on the year or the year before that, in December or something, where a person was set on fire. And this was something that we came across, and mm-hmm. This is a homeless person, right? And this is coming at, this was around the time when all the street sweeps and the Hastings Tent City was being decamped, and there was all this uproar about people being on the streets because they have nowhere else to be. Mm-hmm. And I think this was out in the district of Abbotsford, or...
That was here on Hastings.
Hastings.
Wow. Yeah. And when you're talking about... I'm guessing this is setting someone on fire because this person is now driven to hate poor mm-hmm. people or something like that because they're seeing in the news that these street sweeps are happening, for instance. Mm-hmm. Could an argument be made that a street sweep of that nature would be inciting hatred mm-hmm. and therefore would be a violation of people's rights?
100%. Because in this society, people trust the police to do their jobs properly, and it legitimizes the work that they're doing. As well, the City of Vancouver's engineering department was part of the sweeps. So when a city has enacted a program, it legitimizes it. And when the city and the VPD are working closely together, people aren't going to question whether this is the right thing to do or the good thing to do, especially with the narrative that's being put out there by business owners who were saying that it's impacting their business, that there are homeless people in their neighborhoods. Which is really, like you said, Taz, it's the wild, wild west that business is being prioritized over human life, especially when your safety of your person, life and liberty is protected by the Constitution, mm-hmm. the Charter. It's totally legitimized by institutions we are taught to trust and should actually be questioning.
Well, I mean, in the media, the Gastown BIA president was quoted saying that, these people are walking zombies or whatever. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is... What kind of...
Literally dehumanizing.
Yeah.
Just removing all human qualities from someone by calling them a zombie.
And so, when somebody goes out there and targets somebody who is poor, homeless, or using drugs or whatever, I don't think that they feel any sort of, remorse, mm-hmm. right? Because they don't see people as human.
They feel justified in those actions, I guess.
I mean, the city was handing out garbage cans, calling them...
Storage bins.
Yeah, these are your tote bags. I'm sorry, but you want people to put their belongings that for a very long time, people's belongings were being swept away, put into garbage, and now you're literally providing them with garbage cans and calling them personal storage, right? Yeah.
And I guess the same thing could be said about, for instance, the RCMP raiding the Wet'suwet'en lands, mm-hmm. right? Where that's in potentially inciting hatred against Indigenous people in the same way that, I guess, in a different way, because this wasn't necessarily caused by police, but in 2020 when COVID hit, and then we saw these hate crimes against mm-hmm. People who look Chinese, I guess, mm-hmm. in people's eyes. So there are anti-hate speech laws in place in this country, right, where the whole goal of them is to protect certain people from certain types of speech that are intended to incite hatred. But it almost seems like the government itself is participating in this, mm-hmm. and they're almost exempt from it.
That's a really good point.
Is there I know in the U.S. we hear a lot about qualified immunity, where police are often exempt from being charged for their crimes because they can argue, well, we have qualified immunity. We thought we were acting in the best interest of someone, or we thought we were doing the right thing, and therefore we don't have to be held to the same standard as a regular citizen.
Yeah.
Does that same concept apply in Canada? Does it have a different name?
Yes, I'm actually not sure if it's called anything in specific, but it happens all the time. And the most recent incident of that I can think of is with Jared Lowndes' case, where the inquiry did not go forward because it was believed that the police were acting in their like lawful duty. So we might not call it that, but I think it's the same thing. Interestingly, though, that qualified immunity is being challenged right now in the States. In Canada, who knows?
Yeah.
The IAO runs roughshod for the cops all the time. The OPCC does the same thing. One thing I should mention is in all of this, something an ex-colleague of ours pointed out to us often, Meenakshi Mano, there is no supports for families going through that process with the IAO or the OPCC or any police accountability process. The cops get provided lawyers, time off, money, their pensions are safe, families are left reeling with the loss of their loved ones, and no supports. So, it's cops get away with it. And you can't really trust a cop. You can't believe them. You can't take them at face value. No. And you can't rely on them to stick to their word.
No, they can lie to you. They are allowed to lie to you in pursuit of an investigation.
And then run for politics.
Yeah, you literally cannot trust a word they say.
Yeah. Run for politics, say they believe in certain things, and then switch parties the other day and join a party that goes entirely against everything they believe in. And Eleanor Sturko is a great example of that, right?
And for context, Eleanor Sturko was an MLA for the BC Liberals, now called BC United, who walked the floor and joined the BC Conservatives as a queer person, joining a party that had just put out legislation that would have restricted the rights of queer people.
Yeah.
Typical cop behavior.
You cannot trust cops. I'm looking at you, people.
So moving on now to another one of Pivot's 5 areas of policy focus, which is sex workers' rights. This has come up a few times already. What rights do sex workers have that the general public may not be aware of? And what rights do sex workers not have that you believe they should have?
Sex workers operate in Canada with extreme precarity. They are constantly at risk of being criminalized because their clients can be arrested and charged. Anyone they work with to keep them safe can be arrested and charged. Like I mentioned, it's very hard for sex workers to open bank accounts because their form of work is not considered legitimate, or sometimes it's not even considered consensual by the state. So yeah, if people didn't know that, it's pretty shocking because it puts sex workers in a really dangerous situation all the time. They can't reach out to report violence from a client because then their client could be arrested and charged, and anyone else that person works with could be arrested and charged.
And we know from previous work that Pivot has done with sex workers and sex work-led organizations that sex workers don't trust police either. They don't trust to go to them, and knowing that sure you can sell sex legally, you can't advertise it publicly, you can't have buyers, and you can't have anybody working with you to provide any kind of services, like somebody sitting at a reception or somebody driving you from one place to another. And then of course the stigmatization of sex work also means that sex work and trafficking are conflated. This obviously impacts trans workers quite a bit, disproportionately, especially Black and Indigenous sex workers. Of course, migrant workers are impacted by this, and we should be looking to groups like SWAN and PACE for a deeper analysis of it. But we also very recently had a new coworker join our team, Simone Akianu, who has brought a great deal of wisdom, an incredible understanding of the ways in which race and gender impacts a lot of the areas of our work. And today, June 6th, they were doing a Know Your Rights training with PACE Society, and it was pretty well attended, I would say. So things are turning around in the sense that, like, there are very dedicated people really honing in on the legal conditions of sex workers in Canada. And I think one of the biggest challenges right now is the PISEPA, it's the, Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, which essentially is the piece of legislation that, like, really conflates sex work and trafficking and takes away that sovereignty over their own bodies. Yeah,
and that's something that I've heard in reaching out to organizations for this podcast. I reached out to a number of organizations that support sex workers. I had one in particular get back to me and say, we're not coming on your podcast because you talk to someone who works in anti-human trafficking. And they were, I guess, concerned about that subject being conflated. So there's clearly a lot of concern about how
we were concerned about
we
that.
We had the same concern. We had our sex work policy consultant listen to that episode, and she thought it was great because it didn't conflate sex work with human trafficking at all.
Yeah, and I think that unless you do listen to the episode, I can completely understand why someone would go, we have to make sure that this is okay.
Yeah. The more recent thing I should mention is that Pivot, with support and consultation from PACE Society, submitted a legal opinion to the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, in which Pivot argues that policing violence must be situated in our understanding of the structural harms of gender violence that sex workers endure within criminalized context. And our core recommendations, I'm omitting quite a bit here. Hopefully one day we can have a more in-depth conversation within all of our policy areas. But our core recommendations included, 1, to repeal immigration and criminal laws prohibiting or otherwise criminalizing sex work and other quality of life, quote-unquote, offenses that adversely impact sex workers. And 2, to divest from police as a response to harm and reallocate resources towards non-carceral, adequate housing, and community-led support services that respond to, prevent, and mitigate the structural harms shouldered by marginalized communities. That's to point out that Pivot's approach will always be to try and address root causes. Often we see governments bringing in legislations to address the symptoms of those root causes. And I suppose addressing the root causes of these issues requires a radical approach that it, departs from the reformist sort of approach that a lot of, governments want to take. They don't want to lose votes. So, do the Band-Aid solution and see where that goes, when in reality what is needed is a hands-off our bodies approach, right? Sorry, weird coming from a man who's like not engaged in sex work and does not have to deal with these issues.
Yeah, well, and speaking of one of these symptoms, I've heard from a number of sex workers who've talked about police picking them up, driving them clear across the city and dropping them off with no supports, no way of getting home. The idea, I guess, is to scare them, to inconvenience them. And it seems like that is made possible by the power dynamics created through legislation, right? Like if sex work, purchasing and selling was entirely legal, I don't think that they would necessarily get away with that as easily as they do, knowing that there's very little recourse for a sex worker.
Certainly. And I mean, that's an important point, because if the cops are picking up a sex worker, they are seeing that person, and that means they're street sex workers and people who rely on public space for any variety of things, including conducting their business, are easily going to be targeted and more highly criminalized than people who can do their work in the safety of an indoors location. Safety so-called, because you can still experience a lot of violence indoors. But yeah, that's where a lot of our work is focused, is people who use drugs outside in public space, people who do sex work outside in public space, people who live outside in public space, because poverty and stigma are the root of the issues that those communities experience.
People should take the time to read this report called Red Women Rising report that speaks to how a lot of missing women, actually speaks to a whole lot more, but the thing that I always remembered was how a lot of the missing women from the downtown east side were identified by other women and folks that were working in community like the Downtown East Side Women's Center, and many more than the VPD could ever identify. I think that again speaks to the ability of community-led initiatives to actually work more often than not. And that also speaks to the ability of community to keep each other safe even. But you can't fight against cops that are picking your friends up or not investigating your friends' disappearances, right? So we really have to, like you mentioned, analyze these power dynamics that are taking place on the ground and understand that the people with the least amount of power are asking for things and are being very clear about it. And if we want to address root causes that we're, concerned about, or the symptoms that show through those, then we should listen to them. Just like we should be listening to people who use drugs, people who are homeless or precariously housed. It's those lived and living experiences and belonging in community that really informs the solutions that would actually work. So to hear the police are picking up people and driving them far away or intimidating them, that's not new. We've all heard about the Starlight Tours, right? But what it does mean is that then we all have to do a better job of being more connected in community. So then when we hear about it, can acknowledge it and then also spread the word, because if you don't know, then you're not going to be able to speak out against it.
Well, and to that point about police not investigating certain people, I mean, we recently heard about the infamous serial killer Picton dying, right? And or being murdered, I guess, in prison. He could have been caught way earlier if the police had been willing to listen to people in the community, and also if they weren't friendly with him to begin with, right?
They were on his property having barbecues, apparently, right?
Exactly.
I remember from way back when I was studying crim, one of my crim profs were like, yeah, there were many opportunities where the police could have actually ruined the investigation by mishandling the whole situation on top of being friendly with someone. And, this is the weird part. There were a lot of very powerful people in positions in this province that knew Picton and were chummy with him.
Yeah, it's a weird world out there. And that sort of brings me to close to the end of my questions for you. I had another question around homelessness and whether people who are homeless or houseless often find themselves having legal challenges. I think we've pretty well covered that. Yes, they do. And we've covered the reasons for that. So I want to move on to one of my final questions, which is, what is your hope for the future of Pivot Legal Society?
My hope is that we decriminalize sex work completely, 100%, so that sex workers can do their job safely, unionize if they want to, be protected by the Employment Standards Act, just receive all the same privileges that any other employee does. My hope is that we can decriminalize the use of illicit drugs, the possession and use and sale of illicit drugs, and produce a safe supply for people. I hope that every person in BC every person in Canada has a safe place to live, a safe, dignified home, that people don't have to rely on public space if they don't want to, but if they do rely on public space, that it's not criminalized. And one of my biggest hopes for Pivot is that we keep doing conversations like this one to talk about abolition and imagining a fairer, more just world for people.
Yeah, ditto.
Yeah.
I would echo that.
And what can our audience do to help achieve that future? This is a sort of a question I ask at the end of all of the podcasts, what our audience can do to help. So with regard to creating this better future where maybe the police are abolished and maybe sex workers aren't criminalized, and whatever else it might be that you're working towards, what do you think our audience can do to take steps in that direction?
My answer always will be to get to know your neighbors. And tenant organizing is like a great way to like begin your activism journey as well, I would say. But yeah, get to know your neighbors, be aware of your surroundings and look out for each other, and more importantly, get organized. I think showing up to things when they're happening is great. Continuing that journey within your circles is even better and needed. In terms of helping Pivot and the work that we're engaged in, I think remaining critical of what we are consuming from our media and from our governments is incredibly important. I think having book clubs is great because a lot of this information is dense, a lot of this information is quite nuanced, and a lot of this information is often not readily available, which is why we always try our best to do the public education in a good way. But yeah, get together with others, really invest your time in building community, finding that belonging in community, I think is incredibly important. In terms of supporting Pivot specifically, I think I should mention we're a very small team. Often people think that there's like so many of us. It's like 6 people in a trench coat. And we have like 3 active lawyers doing litigation, and the rest of us are like, doing operations, comms, development funding, research, community meetings. We're like sort of all over the place. We don't really accept, like I mentioned earlier, accept funding from sources that rely on carceral approaches, so like proceeds of crimes and all that kind of shit. We don't do that. We don't take the gaming grants and all that kind of stuff. We don't go to the VPD or the city or any of that stuff. So we do rely on everyday people, small time donors, and often more than donation, it's engagement with our work, sharing, talking to us, inviting us to have these kind of conversations. I think it's very important. Using our reports. I think, Nina, this was your note, using our reports and interviews in school, because you did?
I did when I was in school. I referenced Pivot's work. There's great research and reporting at Pivot. We have incredible minds who have written blogs with us. I think I would totally echo everything that Taz said. And I would say that if you want to help Pivot, the best thing you can do is live the abolitionist future that we need. Organize yourselves, create an abolitionist book club, join a worker co-op, create a worker co-op, help out your neighbors, get to know the people around you, offer your support, a helping hand to anyone you see who needs it, whether you know them or not.
Eye contact. I can't believe I'm saying this. Eye contact is so important. Often we don't want to look at people, especially people that have been stigmatized and marginalized, right? Just that connection with a total stranger can honestly change your day.
Making sure people feel seen.
Yeah, it's incredibly important. The one thing I do want to say is that I'm like actually very happy about the ways in which activists are like cross-pollinating right now and showing up for each other, right? I think that's really beautiful, and there's no shortage of groups for people to plug into. Personally, I would say like really pay attention to folks at Care Not Cops, for example, Abolitionist Care and Belonging, Pace Society, we love them. Vandu, a Vancouver Network of Drug Users. There are working groups within Vandu, like Our Homes Can't Wait. We're incredibly, like people that are coming in with so much wisdom that it blows my mind. I can't recommend getting plugged in to your local community groups enough. Like, I think it's very important. And sorry for saying like so much just now.
You're all good. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about so far in this podcast that you think is really important to mention before we wrap things up?
Actually, there is a bit. I don't know if this needs to be included, but there are pieces that I feel like we missed or didn't cover. Mm-hmm. I wonder if, like, at the end we can do some of that.
Yeah. Well, this would be the chance to do that.
This would be the chance?
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's important to mention we prioritize relationships with people who are directly impacted by the social issues we work on. I think that's very important. We're doing our best to employ an anti-oppression lens in a lot of our work and approaching our work from a decolonial lens, but we have our own problems that we are, kind of struggling with it like any other organization, and so we have to do our own work as well. I think it's important to mention that we meet with grassroots organizations regularly, and all of our work is directed from the ground up. I think more specifically, if we are to go back to the campaign pieces, I want to mention 3 websites people should pay attention to right now. One is killercopscanada.wordpress.com. Another one is trackinginjustice.ca. And then the third one is notinthepublicinterest.com. I should also mention that 2023 was a 15-year high in VPD shootings, both fatal and non-fatal. VPD budget is growing very close to $500 million. That's a big number. A really important thing to note is that often data about the police is coming from the police, so it's often underreported and overreported in some other instances, like how many drugs they seized and what they qualify as a weapon. And when they roll out their tables full of stuff in front of the media, we should really take a magnifying glass and look at all of them, because there might be just a 4-inch knife on there that is perfectly legal. There's many ways police sort of misrepresent situations, so it's always good to be critical of them. I think it's important to remind people that aside from the issue of police conduct, people everywhere are realizing that there are alternatives to policing to keep us safe, healthy, and prosperous, and that we have years and years of education and research that so many Black activists and scholars and Indigenous people have provided, and other racialized groups have provided, that we can learn from. One very important piece about Pivot's work regarding sex work campaign is that since 2007, Pivot has been engaged in constitutional challenges to the criminal code provisions, communication laws, Bawdy House law, procuring law, which is like public interest standing granted in 2012. So we are challenging things in the court system, and it is delivering certain results, but the fight is sort of going on, and now we're coming up against this so-called culture war that is conflating a lot of issues with, protection of children and families, and those seem to be large misdirections instead of addressing the core issues felt by the people that are impacted and are working in those areas. it's a pretty big tactic right now to like redirect attention to some other issue and scapegoat people. Unfortunately, a lot of trans youth are being targeted right now as well because of this kind of stuff. And it's important to keep that in mind.
Particularly with an election coming up in BC where that's going to be a hot button issue.
Oh, and Canada-wide, you know, the pendulum has swung, and the rhetoric is not stopping. Also, things are even more complicated for migrant sex workers. We should mention legal status for employment and street entrenched sex workers, of course, because they use public space, like Nina mentioned. We wrote down a note here that it's 73% of sex workers in Vancouver surveyed in the Bias Forest report in 2023 identified as being people with disabilities.
And I suppose that speaks to the fact that people on disability are receiving very little money to survive, and so they're not necessarily people who are passionate about sex work. They're people that are forced into it for necessity.
Yeah, maybe, right? Yeah, there is that. I think there is that angle as well, for sure. And some engage out of their own volition.
Some people with disabilities like to do sex work because they can set their own schedule. They don't have to adhere to a full-time schedule, which they just can't show up for.
Yeah, not to say, because we've had this conversation about sex work in the past, about how not all people engaging in sex work are forced into it. It's not that type of situation. And if people are being forced into it, that's wrong. But there are plenty of people out there that do it because they want to do it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, economic stability is there to a certain extent, I suppose. And being able to set your own hours, having your own space, especially if you are somebody who is housed and like has that safer spot. But a lot of folks that are engaged, disabled folks that are engaged in sex work, a lot of them are worried about a loved one overdosing, like 60%. 46% had difficulties paying for food. So like it makes sense if you're like you were mentioning, living on disability rates, you can't, right? It's nearly impossible.
Don't even cover rent in a lot of them.
45% were Indigenous, and often 35% of them were not housed. And 29% had dependents. So that source of income is incredibly important. I think that's probably covering most of what we might have missed. There is one last thing that I think, Nina, do you want to cover? Like the last bit?
Shout out to all the grassroots organizers and activists around the world for putting your labor and very limited time on this earth into dismantling the systems that harm us and creating the systems that will place us in a freer, healthier future.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for joining me today. This has been a social justice podcast. I'm your host, Nicola Spurling, and I've been joined today by Taz and Nina from Pivot Legal Society. You've been listening to a social justice podcast, an exploration of our world's social issues, hosted by Nicola Spurling on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwikwetlem, Katzie, and Qayqayt peoples.